Hey, this is Alex Head, founder of Subtext Radio.
This is Subtext.
Please go ahead and click the like button and the subscribe button. It really helps us to reach new audiences and promote the artists that we work with. Hit like and hit subscribe.
Realness has a subtext.
That was very synced.
I think I clapped before you.
Well, visually and orally, it was synced for me. So we'll only know in the post production.
More for you. All
Yeah.
right then, let's do it.
Well, hi. Where are we now? It's Monday. It's the 4th year anniversary special. That's something which we don't need to dwell on for too long, but it's worth noticing. And where should we start?
I'm going to start with recording, because I can hear the rustling of your paper through the recording.
Uh-oh. Okay.
I quite liked it, but I don't know what it is. It could even be the airwaves between your fingers as they rustle past.
Yeah, desperately trying to get something to function in this crazy heat, some tech to function.
All right. Was it too soon to throw out a word already?
No, I don't think so. I think, the plus and the minus of doing this every sort of 6 months is that there really is no form whatsoever, is there? There's just two people chatting. I probably would find it easier. We're friends.
Two friends chatting. Chatting.
Exactly. Yeah. All right.
You'd find it easier. No, go on. You'd find it easier.
Oh no, I was just going to say I'd find it easier if I couldn't see myself speaking. So I've just hidden the video, and it's already easier.
I just stare at myself the whole time. That's why I do online stuff. Make sure how I'm beginning to look. If I'm beginning to look my age or not.
I wonder what the secret was. Yeah.
Zoom filter.
Yeah, I don't know. It's something I've had to try and get over. I mean, I have had to get over it, because professionally speaking, it turns out you do have to be in Zoom meetings. You can't actually just say, no, I'm not doing that.
Well, I love it. We're down a path that we didn't even write down. So, recording is the first word we're going to talk about. We're meta today. We're making it meta. So I'll start. Right?
Okay. Yeah, please.
A lot of the words that we came up with today are ones that I was inspired to include after the last session, which was time ago. When was that?
Yeah, that's December. Yeah,
6 months ago.
Yeah.
Hence the every 6 months thing. So recording, I chose recording because, I work in sound, I work in music, I work in radio, and all the theory and methods around it. And this idea of recording is very much linked to listening, which maybe will come later, or maybe we'll just mesh together. And it's what I find really fascinating about recording. Maybe it's just really obvious, but I just like this idea of how it. The question is what changes when you press record? What changes when you press record? And it is linked to what you just said. What changes when you come on Zoom? What changes when is it a performance? Is it real? And I think all those questions, even though I've thought about them for years now, I just still find them really fascinating. And how many things we base on a recording of something. I mean, this kind of goes back to our thoughts about archives and what's kept and what isn't kept, and what's considered where you make the cut. I like this question of where you make the cut. Where do you decide to stop recording? And I find all of that really fascinating. And I think it's abstract stuff, and it's not abstract stuff. It's big questions that I think I've been concerned with for a long time, but I wanted to revisit it because I felt like I was just taking it for granted. Let me be more specific. So we cannot ignore the fact that in many kind of artistic, academic, discursive circles, all these questions are coming out, like what counts as knowledge, who creates knowledge, who's allowed to say what is and isn't knowledge, different alternative epistemologies, what counts as history, who's telling the history, how do we have to tell the history, like all of these questions are infused, like everything's infused with this at the moment. And like from the level of like full on expertise and like academic knowledge, theoretical knowledge, for better or worse, from different angles, right down to just commercializing on using a word. And I find like that is everywhere. And I think I wanted to include this word recording again, just to kind of like remind myself that it's still something it's still a focus, even though it's everywhere and seems a bit like, I was a bit like, oh, I'm really over it. I found myself saying like, I'm really over this idea of like, where's the cut? How do we decide? And I kind of wanted to like remind myself that I can't be over it because it's my fucking topic. So that's kind of my thought behind it. And we can get into it more technically if you like, but that's kind of my thought behind it. Recording information, basically. So, bounce.
Yeah, I mean, I think it remind me why this is fun, because it does trigger all these ideas, and it is us, to some extent, we're just recreating the kinds of environments that we might have found ourselves in, not necessarily together, but like fairly often, on a panel or like discussing something in public and kind of improvising a bit and getting into this dialogic process, which I really enjoy. It makes me think a lot about injustice, that idea of recording in the way that you describe it, because there are these kind of like taken for granted injustices which go on amongst like cultural production and of course like the creation and the writing down of history, like the storing of history. And that, like you say, it can be taken all the way into language itself, like, this show that we're also broadcasting today, Rogue Syntax, also makes a lot of points about like the way in which grammar reflects the general kind of rule-based system of knowledge sharing and creation itself. But I'm thinking particularly about the way in which an injustice can resonate with one person and not with another. And I'm thinking about this, I was thinking a lot about this really niche example, like just yesterday, I think it was, where I guess because like everything you listen to that's good from the 90s in hip hop and up into the early 2000s was probably produced by Jay Dilla, right? Like that's sort of one of these, he's this kind of background producer figure, beat maker that no one really knew, certainly not when I was a kid. I had no idea even who he was, that he existed. But like, the Fugees, The Score, Far Side, Lab Cab in California, a lot of Tribe Called Quest. Actually, he produced like a lot of the beats for a lot of that stuff. And he's kind of like, he was cool just to be credited, in the album art and not be a big deal. The reason I bring this up is because when he passed, and he passed very young, there were these bags of his mixtapes, which were put in storage. And I remember there was this podcast about this years ago. And basically, the amount of money his work has made is like ridiculous. But he rarely saw the full return on that. And when he died, his mum was actually in a huge amount of debt. And so someone actually dug up, like he had them like tapes, bags and bags of tapes in a storage facility. And someone actually like found them and broke them out. And basically they discovered that like if they released any of it, it all belonged, just through contractual means, it all belonged to record companies. So there's these bags of tapes of like basically what would be considered the best production and the best hip hop music of our age, and it's just totally inaccessible. I thought that was really interesting, and like just the mad injustice of that, because he died of a complication that was incredibly expensive, and like the medical bills basically put his mum in a ton of debt. But yeah, so like that, just that imbalance. Anyway, that's what triggered it. That's what it triggered for me. But yeah. Long live Jay Dilla, man. He's just amazing. Amazing.
I like that you, as always, I like that you brought a concrete example to our floaty thoughts. But yeah, I love. Oh, I can hear an airplane in the background, and I'm mentioning
nice
so that it's okay to use the sound as part of the radio. Oh, it's a helicopter. Helicopters over Neukölln. Okay. That's a good example, and I like it, and I love the fact that you brought this idea of injustice to it, because that is essentially what it is. And I think there are loads of examples like that. And wow.
But strange counterpoint to that, Nina Simone, I've got my, right? Like, so I've got my hands, I've got my hair, da.
Yeah.
There was an interesting situation in Czech Republic this last year when I was staying there, where we watched this film Hairspray, and it's right? It's like this 60s film, and
I
it's
like Hairspray.
Really
I like
mental.
Hairspray.
Yeah, it's not bad, but it's very of its time, and it's like this particular articulation, and all the way through the film, they're singing like bits and pieces of this song, and I was always like, oh, did they steal that from Nina Simone? And it was like becoming like a kind of intergenerational conflict with my godmother, and being like, you know, because it's happened so often that people's music has just been nicked, like black people's music and people of colour and so forth, has just been, you know, edited out where it came from. But actually it got to the point where it got to a heated discussion. I looked it up and I was like, oh shit, she wrote it after the film. And it was this wonderful moment of just like, okay, you know, like the exception that proves the rule. Anyway, but that was
you know
fun.
what? No, but sorry, just one last thing, because now you've made me, yeah, totally. I just thought of another example. Now it seems silly to say it, but do you remember, like, recently there was that thing about Anita Baker, you know, who sang Sweet Love?
Okay.
Sweet Love. And she was saying something like, I can't remember all the details, but it was something like there was an anniversary of either one of her records or her or something, and so like loads of people were streaming her music, and she was basically like saying, stop streaming my music because I don't own the masters yet and I'm not getting any of this money. And there was this huge thing about that, and I thought that was quite a kind of a, like, to add to the example of Jay Dilla earlier, like I think that was, yeah, I don't know. I just thought that was quite interesting. I'm not quite, I haven't got all the details, and I think she's going to own them really soon, like in the next year or so. But she was literally like, don't stop streaming on Spotify because I don't own the masters, hence the recordings, right?
Yeah,
that's what that means. Oh, well, the edited mixed.
I have no idea how it works. I've got no idea how it works, but it's just interesting that once you put something out there in the world, it has its own life as well. I mean, there's a lot of injustice that comes with why and how that unfolds, but that's the case, isn't it, a lot of time? I mean, anyway, let's...
Anyway, so I feel that was a good...
Real-life experience, maybe that's a real-life experience.
Lived experience.
Lived experience. Lived experience. Okay, well, do you want to kick us off with lived experience?
So... Similarly to the motivation behind recording is my motivation behind lived experience. It's just fucking everywhere now. Are we allowed to swear? I don't know. It's everywhere. And it's also what I base a lot of my work on, like educational, academic, whatever you want to call it. And that is a blessing and a curse. And I'm just going to talk in idioms. No, no. And I remember at the time there was something like Kamala Harris was talking about, like, we've got to start talking from our lived experience and and there was suddenly this huge focus on all this stuff that, like, you know, black feminist epistemologies like Hill and like Audre Lorde and like all this stuff that we've been reading for years, and again keeps coming up again on the spectrum that I said before, like the really, really knowledgeable stuff, and then the kind of just you bandying around the words just for commercial purposes, this spectrum I mentioned before. It was just really bizarre. All of a sudden, like, I'm writing something about like Patricia Hill Collins and all this stuff, and then all of a sudden Kamala Harris is talking about lived experience, and I was just like, where are we in the world? What is going on? And then there was also like an article in The Guardian about it, and it was something like we should be using our lived experience as examples of knowledge. And I read that and I was just like, yeah, no shit. And so I was trying to be like, where are we with this? Like, and again, very abstract. There's this bubble, maybe, or a community or a movement or a group of people or discourses that talk about lived experience as knowledge. And then I'm constantly reminded that there's a lot of people that don't class it as knowledge. So I know what my thoughts are on this, and you know, a lot of it is backed up with, like, again, for better or worse, a lot of it is backed up with academic stuff, but then a lot of it is backed up with lived experience as well. And and I guess whilst I think it's super important, and it kind of goes without saying for me at least, that it's super important, and like, yes, the narratives and stories of people who've experienced something constitutes knowledge. But what I'm beginning to experience now, and what I'm beginning to observe now, is like, okay, where do we go? Literally, where do we go from here then? Where do we go from this point of accepting this knowledge, accepting this experience as knowledge? Like, what do we do with it? Where does it go? And does it matter? Because I feel like there is, it's like with feminisms, no? Like there's the like institutionalizing feminisms, institutionalizing alternative knowledge. You know, what are the pros and cons? What does that mean? Who gets left behind? Who doesn't get left behind? And are we just recreating the same structures? And then last thing, even if we acknowledge that we are recreating these same structures, are they still just a little bit better because we've been able to chip away at them by being able to push something else through it? Okay.
Yeah, I love it, man. It's so interesting. It's like catching up with a part of your brain that you hadn't quite articulated, you hadn't learned well, or you articulated differently. So this is the bit where I get to talk in English about my new experience working at a vaccination center in Berlin. So I can't go into too much detail because of the private sphere. Now I'm sort of trying to translate the German directly. It doesn't work, but basically like people's privacy. But I've had very similar thoughts since I've started working there in the last couple of weeks. So let me just dial back to where we started. So let me start with the basic lived experience. You do half a day in a mask and you do half a day not in a mask. That anyway is pretty bonkers in terms of theatre, in terms of like lived theatre, right? So in terms of just any performance artist to have done that, you know, all kinds of stuff would come off of it. But you don't really think about it because you're on the job and everyone's been in a mask for 2 years anyway, a year and a half, whatever. But it's a pretty rare privilege because what you do find is that you're trying to map your experiences outside of this this building, let's just say, and you're trying to map them back into the building with a kind of optimistic attitude because you've heard ahead of time that people are really nice and they're positive and that there's a kind of good atmosphere. So you enter in, you know, the whole thing's in German. So for me, I always feel like there's this performative aspect to it, like we were discussing before we went on air. And what you start to notice is that there's a huge barrier there where you're just like have your eyes to try and communicate. And I don't really mean with the public, because with the public, they're just going to come and go. You know, you get through 100 people plus every day. But with your colleagues, it's like really important to show solidarity. And it's really difficult to do that with just your eyes until the shift changes and you go back into like the Anmeldung or like the, I guess it would be like the reception aspect of the whole thing, like en masse. And suddenly you're sitting next to someone without a mask and you see their face and they're just like illuminated and all their personality sort of is illuminated. And that's very special. So to take that to another level, you also have a relationship with the security personnel, which is like really on a level. And it's the first time that's the thing that really struck me the most is that the people doing security, which are like stereotypically have kind of like an Arabic and more Eastern background, but everyone is like, good morning, eye contact, good evening, have a nice Feierabend, eye contact, like all the way through, like you're cycling through this big construction, this big complex. And I was like, oh, wow, that's different. Like, that's really fucking different. Like, it's depressing that that's different, but it's kind of special. And so then what you ask yourself is like, there's this moment which is being triggered by having a confrontation with the reality of this pandemic that we're sort of in a different part of. I wouldn't even say we're really emerging because it's so unpredictable. But you're in this kind of almost like that idea that you just mentioned of like a real life experience forming a knowledge which is then carried and borne out in wider society or in wider discourse. That's like World War One. It's like the trenches became, you know, people have written about this a lot, like the trenches were like the most authentic experience you could have was to go into the fucking trenches and like probably get parts of you blown up and like come out again. And like everyone said, yeah, they would do it again. I mean, obviously lots of people got PTSD and it's a horrific experience from the outside. But actually a lot of people like based, you know, a lot of poets, a lot of people were like, that's it, that's the real. Obviously it's not trench warfare in the vaccination center. It's the complete opposite, really. It's like, but you do suddenly take a perspective on the pandemic where you're inside looking out. You're no longer a victim of this virus. You're actually part of the mechanism which is going to treat it, essentially. So you're in this organism of organization, and it is terribly well organized. And you start asking yourself, like, how could you bring that positive feeling and that eye-level contact and that, like, performative caring that you're doing for each other out into society? Because as soon as you leave the complex and you go back to the supermarket, you're like, oh, fuck, like... You know, and it's very little energy that it takes to produce an environment like that. But like, yeah, that would be really interesting, wouldn't it? To see like in a year's time or 2 years' time or whatever, like, could there be a positive appreciation of seeing each other's full face and smiling at each other, which we've taken for granted, you know, which informs how we kind of go on with things. Because it's just going to be an unfolding catastrophe anyway. So it's nice to have a smile and a wink. Yeah.
I love that last line. No, wicked. I love it that you've given a very lived experience example. And it is exactly what I was saying. Like, what do we do with this new knowledge? What do we do with the knowledges, you know, on this smaller scale? You know, like, what do we do with this new knowledge? Like, do we integrate it? And like, what's at stake if we do or don't? And I think that's kind of exciting. Like, and yeah, like what's at stake if we suddenly acknowledge the fact that, like, oh, so like everyone in this like vaccination center is really friendly to each other. Why don't we do that in other contexts? I know it's a very kind of reduced example, if I may. Like, it's a very, but it still illustrates the point. So.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's not without its conflicts and stuff. And like people, you know, there's always this, I mean, I think I'm just like very sensitive, but like, of course, I always meet people's cynicism first. But what I always like to do is like slowly wear down the cynicism. And like, yeah, that's particular. But I've has just written it down, mostly worked. Yeah.
Oh, I like it. Oh, I love it. Love it. I've written down, what do we do with the new knowledge? What's at stake? So you never know, that you might get something out of me from that. Thanks for that.
Awesome.
Next one, let's do nepotism.
Okay.
Because
excellent.
you said that one, and if we don't have time for all of them, then egal. What time is it?
Yeah, sure. I don't know how long we've been whacking on for. I think about 15 minutes. Or maybe 20 minutes. All right, so nepotism, as you say, it's a juicy subject. And it's one of those things where I'm thinking more and more about it because inevitably, as things reopen, the connections and networks and everything will sort of start to re-emerge. And I'm very aware that there's this moment now where you can either go back to, you can try and reproduce the kind of scenarios which existed prior, or you can acknowledge that there's something new. And anyway, I feel like for me, there's a lot of life changes going on. So it's a good time to think about values, maybe. And there's also like, I have a lot of need. I've been away from all of this practice and all these institutions for like a year and a half, like doing the book. And so now it's like this question of like, what is nepotism exactly? Because of course, to some extent we rely on it, to some extent it's a give and take situation. But I figured maybe one of the definitions for me is just that like, it's a lack of quality. You know, it's like when you give someone to something, but really deep down you feel like the quality wasn't there. Like the thing that you really wanted, it just wasn't there. And yet you kind of I mean, I like to think that I don't really ever do that, but I sometimes wonder why and how it happens. And I hope that it doesn't happen where I'm the beneficiary, but I'm sure that it does on some level. Yeah, what do you think about that?
I have lots of thoughts about this. I'm going to cough first. So I'm just like speaking it out just for the sake of the recording, you know?
Yeah.
So these are my thoughts. So nepotism in its kind of traditional sense and understanding and use, it conjures up these images of like, you know, rich white men giving rich white men jobs and the sons of these rich white men jobs and the sons-in-laws of these rich white men jobs. So there's this image, right? And then there's the 13 years lived experience that I've had as a, you know, what do you want to call me, like feminist, whatever, artist, educator living in Berlin. And this is where it muddies it a little bit. But I remember having a conversation with someone else about how I was talking about how, like, you know, artists, and you know this, artists, but not just artists, but also academics, whatever, artists succeed through their networks. And these networks can be built up in different ways. It can be friends that you do projects with. It can be you're part of a festival and somebody approaches you because they've seen your work. I mean, this has happened to both of us. This has happened to, like, you know, you're my friend because you heard a radio show or something, and then you were like, "Hey up."
Yeah, but that's different. That's the thing.
No, not finished.
No, I know you're not.
Not finished. Keep it. Hold it. But I've had conversations with people before where they interpret that as nepotism because honestly, if I get money to do a project, I pick a team, the core team of people. Like at least of a couple of people I know I can work with well, and I know I can work with them well because I've worked with them well because I know them because they're good, and then it's like, where do you make the cut? Where does the line finish? Of course, I also like to include new people. That's the idea, right? But is that also nepotism? That's one thing. That's this idea, like, because for me it's really clear that that's different, but but then, as I said, like, some people think, oh, but it's nepotism if you only ever work with your friends, and I'm like, I don't know if I agree with that.
No, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all. That's why it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. I just want to say one last thing, sorry, and then I'm done.
No.
Even though actually I'm completely disrupting it. It should be more of a conversation, but
I'm listening.
Oh, listening. One thing that you also said, which I thought was nice. I can't remember what it was, but it made me think of this idea of authority and like and hierarchy. So I just want to slip this in here. So I recently was thinking about my own thoughts about hierarchy. This is probably like really scandalous what I'm saying. Like, yes, we are striving to break down hierarchies. Yes, we are striving to break down hierarchies. Doesn't matter because they're always going to exist anyway, in small ways, right? And the reason why I think that is because that's a bit dramatic what I said there. So like hierarchies are, so that's the thing with hierarchies. And then there's this idea of authority, right? And I've been in some contexts recently at universities where sometimes I think that I'm coming across like I don't respect this authoritative figure that might be a professor or a professor, doctor, blah, blah, blah. And then I suddenly thought, okay, but what do I see as authority? I don't see authority as a title. I recognize authority as being the person in the room with the expertise and the person who's taking the responsibility. And that's how I acknowledge authority. And that may or may not align with the official hierarchy. So I just wanted to throw that in. I thought you might find that interesting. I wanted to throw that framework in when thinking about this idea of picking who you want to work with, saying it really blandly, like picking who you want to work with, picking people that you know. What do you know them based on? Do you know them based on their title? Do you know them based on the fact that they're the son-in-law of someone rich? Or do you know them based on the fact that they have expertise and responsibility, and therefore they are an authority on that subject?
Yeah, I mean, you've blown it open, really. And that's...
I know, soza.
That's what we do. It's what we do. But that's exactly on point. I think if you don't have confidence in the people you're working with, why are you working with them? It's really as simple as that, isn't it? And then if you don't, but if you do still have those like obligations, it's probably because you kind of you're in a situation where it's like, it's not really nepotism anymore, but it's just sort of lazy programming. And after a certain point, if you allow yourself to be programmed in with certain people ad infinitum, then whose responsibility is that? You know what I mean? Like, it's all about power and it's all about agency as usual, really. But yeah, I just think that's something which we find ourselves sometimes looking the other way, or at least there is potential to find ourselves compromised. And I've always tried to avoid that, but once you start seeing it on the horizon, I think it becomes really unattractive and you have to make some structural shift.
Can I ask you a question?
Please.
So, because I also like the way that we've opened this up, because in a way we're not really talking about nepotism, we're talking about a new nepotisms. Want to ask you a question. So when you get invited to do something, do you look at who else has been invited, and do you kind of like check for things like, I don't know, diversity on all levels? Like, do you feel like you do? Because I do automatically from my position, because that's important to me. But considering our positionalities are different, like what do you do, or like what do you or your peers do to take responsibility for that? Because I know that there are some people who full on are like, no, not going to take part in this panel because you've just invited these people, or I'm not going to do this because, and I just wondered how much you've experienced that, or would.
Yeah. I mean, so the same with, the thing is, one tries not to put oneself in a position where you have to say no to things, because it generally creates awkwardness and bad feeling. But definitely in terms of like positioning oneself, it's been pretty much front and center since day one. Is that, like, if it's not a diverse group of people, I mean, I don't think I've even ever been invited into anything where it wasn't like a diverse group and it was kind of intellectually kind of responsible. But I have to say, one thing I did do, where I really, really questioned it for a really long time, was to go and present at on this panel in Dresden for like the European Capital of Culture, and it was super problematic because not only had they called it Neue Heimat 2025 in Dresden, it was also, by bizarre coincidence, I'm hoping it was a coincidence, it was the 5th year anniversary of Pegida that day in Dresden. So they were marching when we were walking to the Deutsche Hygienisches Museum to do this presentation. And the way in which I sort of qualified that for myself is that I did a presentation of decolonial cinema. And I was trying to kind of meet the whole thing head on and just be like, if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. Like, look, this is what I think you should do. And they asked me to talk about my book, like the first one, like the Trouble one, about deviancy. And I was like, I just sort of went in and I was just sort of like, so I'm not going to talk about my book on deviancy, but I am going to talk about decolonial cinema, particularly in a German language speaking context. So I gave myself a kind of a pass on that, but it's not something that I would really feel comfortable settling into as a kind of agent provocateur, because I don't really think that's how I'm necessarily received. And people were very appreciative, but I mean, the whole thing was a bit of a mess, really, and they had some serious conversations that day about what on earth they were doing with the theme of Heimat. I mean, homeland, what the hell? Like, so now, I mean, going forwards, yeah, I guess it's going to be a whole new world. I don't know. I mean, of course, I hope that I will be invited onto stuff on the back of the new book. It's a very political book. It's to do with knowledge creation and how it's made and by whom and for whom, and looking at patterns that go back to 12,000 years. So, but I also know that that book will have a kind of anthropological historical register, and that it does speak to the museum directly. And yeah, I will just have to negotiate that.
Well,
need all the help I can get, really. Yeah.
All I can say is I definitely want to, next time round, I want to add, I've got a topic for next time, which is saying no, because I thought it was interesting what you said about how you want to be in positions, but try not to be in positions where you have to say no, because I found that really interesting. But let's save that for next time. Let's do one last one then, because we're kind of running out a bit of time. Yeah,
we've got about like 3 minutes or something.
I want to do the off-air jams.
Yeah,
because I feel like poor listening. Maybe we could push that for next time, or just cut it.
We can just say that it's a very blunt description of what's been going on the whole time. It's just like a statement piece. There we go, done. Listening.
Listening is a statement piece. It's listening to the world, listening to voices.
Brackets. So off-air gems. What the fuck's going on with off-air gems?
It's
silence.
You know what? Okay, so I'm overwhelmed at the moment, but also really enjoying the fact that realities are just like overlapping each other and on top of each other and existing at the same time. I sometimes sit in online meetings in my sports gear, right? Which I would never do. Which I would never do if I was actually in the university. And it's so clear, like someone else is in a t-shirt, someone else is sitting on their balcony, you know? So there's that. This idea of off-air gems is cute and sweet because it's this notion. You got something. Have you got something?
No, you've got something. You've got something. That's exactly it, man. That's the idea. The jam.
Off-air gems doesn't exist. They're all
fucking on air. Yeah.
Nothing's off air. And so that's what I love about the show. And I thought this at the start because like this is the kind of irony because we were saying off air gems because it's like you and me, the chitsy chats of like how we think about it. Look at you, it's brilliant. I've blown it out.
It's the tracksuit bottom of radio.
Off air gems, there's literally like it's chatting about all these things that we in our privileged circles, whatever, we may not include this in a text we're writing, in a lecture we're giving, whatever. And yet we're still including it here. We're saying it's off our gems, but we're recording it. It's edited. People are listening.
It's so dialogic. It's dialogic as fuck. I'm really, mate, I'm into
nothing's
that.
Off air. Nothing is off air. Especially now. Nothing's off air.
Yeah, we win. The format wins. Let's just leave it like that. The format wins. Congratulations. I mean, that's something I didn't even see it coming. And we must have started this just before it was obligatory. So there you go. Culture really is upstream of politics. That's what they say, and it's true. So, and massive like self-congratulatory pat on the back. For us, but yeah, thank you, man. Thank you for sharing again for another dope ass episode, and it's really refreshing. It really does kind of feel like discourse with someone. That's good.
Shall we sing our jingle?
It would be remiss not to, wouldn't it?
Off-air gems or
yeah.
Variations on a theme. So I'm gonna do 1, 2, 3, and then Off-air
gems.
You are listening to Subtext Radio. Okay, start again.